Hey friends, welcome back. This is the Invitation Podcast, Season 3, Episode 4, The Fruit or the Boot. I'm Kyle.
I'm Phil.
We're excited to dive in. We've got a lot going on, and as always, we want to do a quick recap of the previous episode. It was an awesome one on Jubilee. What's the recap there, Phil?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. The recap here is we're doing this series where we're moving on from Exodus and Moses, and now we're covering some quick points in each one of the books of the Bible. And in Leviticus, a book that is not often read or cherished or preached on, we pulled out this section on Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor. And what we discovered there was that our salvation needs to be celebrated, and it also needs to be worked out. We need to receive forgiveness in a way that it not only affects me, but affects the community. And if it doesn't affect the community, it's not actually the Lord's favor. It's not actually Jubilee. So we definitely encourage you to always go back and listen to that episode. And the connection here will be interesting because they're not there yet, right? Like they've got the Levitical code. It's all set up for worship. It's all set up to lead towards this 50-year plan of what it might look like to live out their faith. But when we get to Numbers, they are in the desert. They're headed towards the promised land, and that brings us to the fruit or the boot. Should we dive in?
Let's dive in.
All right. Well, we're going to be reading from Numbers 13 and 14 today. And Kyle, the first passage there is Numbers 13, verses 21 through 33. It is a little bit longer of a section than we normally read. And for the Old Testament, that's just the way it rolls. So if you're listening, buckle in, buckle up. It's a little bit longer of a passage today, but we need the context of the story. And so, Kyle, before we read today's passage, we need to recognize that the Israelites, as they are going towards the promised land, Moses decides to send 12 spies into the promised land to give a report. What's it like there? Who are the people living there? What's the fruit like? You know, is it as God promised? You could almost say. And so this is kind of what was about to happen before they were to go in as a whole people and
So
to
they
the
couldn't just like send
land.
a drone over.
Nope, no drones yet, no satellite imagery.
No
Yeah,
autonomous
GPS units.
camels.
I was trying to think of an acronym for that, but yeah, no, they had to send 12 human spies, one from each tribe, in to go and give a report. So yes, so you're going to be reading here Genesis. Oh my gosh, Genesis is always on my mind. Numbers 13:21 to 33.
Right on. Let's dive in. Starting with verse 21. So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rahab toward Lebo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community of Kadesh in the desert of Paran, where they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of a great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Enoch, come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them."
All right, thanks for reading that, Kyle. I appreciate you navigating, especially all those difficult city names that sound like planets from Star Wars and, and galaxies from the Star Wars universe. Way to go there. But we have it, right? The spies they cut down some of this fruit. They come back. Caleb gives this awesome report, but some of the rest of the spies spread this slander here, and I want to make a couple observations here. And one is Caleb, right? So Caleb sees that not only have they been rescued from Egypt, but when he goes and spies out the promised land, he reports just how great the fruit is, right? Like we've got two dudes here carrying this branch full of grapes. Like the last time I picked up a bag of grapes, it didn't take much effort. Imagine you and I both having to hold on a branch, right? Hold on a log, the grapes and what that would take. How big are those grapes? What are those grapes tasting like?
Probably pretty darn good, and you can make a lot of wine with it.
A whole lot of wine. Yes, a whole lot of wine, a whole lot of Welch's or whatever. That probably broke a trademark copyright error or something there, but yeah, right.
Insert generic grape juice product here.
That's right. Right. So Caleb sees that, man, there's so much more, right? So we he silenced the people, right? So I love that part too, where it's like, let me have your full attention. This land is worthy of taking. And then we have the contrast, right? The contrast is the men that went up with him denied it. We can't take this land. The land that we explored has people that are going to destroy us of great size. And we'll talk about the Nephilim here in a second. I want to talk about the nature inside of us that does the same, right? So I'll set us up a little bit, and then I'd love to hear what you're thinking about as far as like examples of this. But there's an aspect of our nature, especially those of us that claim to be saved by Jesus, that in certain instances are quick to see the fruit of something and say, I wonder what else there is. I wonder how much more there is, and
Mm.
whether that is to like growing in my faith or maybe fruitfulness in something that I do in my church or in some sort of ministry or even in my work or my family. There's a part of us that hopes quickly and sees the possibilities unfolding and sees with faith things that we would need faith to have happen. Then there's this other side of us that fears and that tells a story over and over and over again that it can't be done, it can't be taken over, and the promises that God made for us to take this great fruit, it's not possible. It's not happening. Can you think of instances of either where we have this great faith or we have these lies or these exaggerations in our head that do this to us?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing is when you talk about, I'll just use, we just talked about this the last episode. Not the story of Jubilee in the Bible, but the story of Jubilee, the incredible conference where we, take college kids out of their typical experience and show them this, what I call a mountaintop experience. It might be, going to another country to serve, or getting out of your daily context and being in a place where you can really hear from the Lord. You can serve others. As we know, when we serve others, oftentimes we get a lot of clarity on our own situation. And so in that context, we can hear very clearly from our Creator some really powerful truths about who we are and our identity. And I call that a mountaintop experience. And when we come back to, back to reality, back to our normal rut, it's very easy for the enemy to steal that from us. It's very easy to start to believe these lies that, well, it didn't really happen like that. It wasn't so special. Who do you think you are that you can make a real impact here?
Yep.
And that, I think, that plays out all the time.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, for me, I know I've used this example before on this show. I can't remember which episode, but doing this podcast was a great challenge for me. It was
Mm,
something I knew I wanted to do. I wanted to scratch the itch of teaching and getting all these thoughts about these Bible stories out there, out of my head, out of my heart, into the world. And I had all these fears and all these doubts and all these hesitations and very real health issues as well that I thought would just get in the way. And I was sharing
mhm,
this to you over and over, the Marco Polo app, and you were like, let's just hit record. And and there was some good fruit that day, and the Phillies won a playoff game during that recording too, and it was a really fruitful day in a lot of ways, and it's still bearing fruit, and not just, we want that fruit to spill over and to flow like milk and honey to you all, but I'm telling you all too, I'm a witness too that it's bore fruit for me. I think it's bore fruit for us in our friendship. I
mhm.
think it's
Big time.
it's bore fruit in people that have listened to us and got in conversations with us about this, and so that was fruit that I could see, but I also had this narrative. I had this story in my head of the giants are too big, right? The
Mm,
Nephilim of my health conditions, the
mm.
Nephilim of my anxieties, right? These giants, these enemies are just going to devour me if I try and put a good foot forward here. And it's all lies, right? Like it's all
Yep.
exaggerations, and we'll get there in a second too. So, but the next thing I want to do with this passage here is how you remember just how long we spent in those first couple chapters of Genesis, and
How could
and
I
the reason
forget?
being, all right, I won't let you forget, and I'm gonna bring us back there now because the part of the genius of the Bible is how it kind of does like variations on a medley, variations on a melody. And here there's all sorts of interesting Genesis 1, not just Genesis 1, 2, and 3 stuff, but Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 stuff going on here. So I just want to point them out just to help us all with the practice of learning these themes and these narratives and then realizing like it's not always exactly the same. And so what do we do with those differences? So for instance, fruit that is like bigger than the size of my head, that feels like a hearkening back to Genesis 1, right? This unstoppable garden of life that is blessed and very good, right? I can only imagine the fruit in that garden, and the fruit that they bring back from the promised land seems to have this Edenic quality
For sure.
to it, right? Genesis 2, right? We're going to find out that it's Caleb and Joshua, right? Are the two that come back with a favorable report and want people to go into the promised land, right? Well, there's two people in the garden before the fall, right? That are working the garden and trying to live into the promises of God, the blessings of God. And then there's Genesis 3. The temptation in Genesis 3 is, do we take of this fruit and eat it? And here it's the opposite. It's, we need to go eat that fruit. We need to go into this garden land and go take that fruit that's being offered to us. It's almost as if the way to the Garden of Eden has been opened,
Mm,
right? And so it's like this
interesting
little
reframe. I like that.
this little reversal, not total reversal of Genesis 3. We'll get there some season 8, season 12, I don't know what season it'll be, but we'll get to the total reversal. But here's this little reversal of Genesis 3 here. And then Genesis 4, right? So is Cain and Abel. We don't often flash back to Cain and Abel, but Cain and Abel bring offerings to the Lord, one of the field, one of the beasts, and one offering receives favor, Abel's offering, and one doesn't. And here it's the opposite direction. It's as if the Lord is bringing a fruit offering to the people to see
Mm,
if they will decide with favor to follow God, right? And so,
Interesting.
yeah, what's going on there? And then there's this reference to the Nephilim. And Kyle, do you remember where the Nephilim are from? Did I mention it this episode? I can't remember. Do you remember where the Nephilim are from in the Bible?
Not at all.
Genesis 6. And so
Genesis 6.
these are the like the giants that I think married the sons of daughters. The sons of God
Oh,
married the
yeah. I
spirits.
always forget how that story
Messing
comes
that up.
together. Yeah.
Yeah, and we often get right to the flood, but there's this weird scene about yeah, the sons of God marrying the daughters of men and having children, and they became the Nephilim, these warriors of old, or something like that. It's this epic little tale, and here they are in Numbers 13. I thought they were wiped out in the flood. What do you think about that, Kyle?
There's a few different theories there. One is that, sure, maybe there's a way. And
Yeah,
then the other is, well, hang on. Maybe this is perhaps an exaggeration that was driven from fear, or as the acronym suggests, false evidence appearing real.
you've always got these little gems of these meanings behind things. That's great. Yeah, it's interesting. There is Jewish lore about the Nephilim that I should remember the name, but that like one of them like hitched a ride on the side of the boat and like
It's
survived the
wild.
flood or something crazy like that. And
That's
that's how
wild.
they basically justify this exact verse as well in their sort of like interpreting of the Bible. That could be true. I'm not trying to plant a flag, but I think it's on the other end of, yeah, I think if I were to tell a tale and start spreading this slander and these rumors about, we shouldn't go into the promised land, I think I would also say, you wouldn't believe it. The Nephilim are there. Remember them in Genesis 6, right? And I'm with you too in that our fears do this, right? And that's kind of
Yeah.
where we're going to keep directing this is like this happens in us too, right? My daughter sees a shadow and immediately it's a ghost or
Sure.
someone else.
And think about, we like to tie back into these larger themes in the Bible and what is said over and over and over. I can't remember how many times. Do not fear. Why do you think that happens so many times? Probably because part of the human experience is to fear. And when you're looking at, potentially a life altering situation that involves a big uncomfortable change, there's a good opportunity to let fear take hold.
Yeah. One of the pieces of advice I always gave students when they were nervous about a test they were going to take, or maybe nervous about asking out a potential significant other,
Hmm.
is you're only nervous because you care,
Yeah,
right? Like you're only anxious because you actually care. We're not anxious about the stuff we don't care about, right? And I think similarly, I think just on the other side of fear is just a promised land that God has waiting for us. And I have tried to train myself to do the same. Like if I feel anxiety, if I feel fear, I start to try and imagine like, okay, what is it that I care about? And what is it that, Satan's trying to like make this lie or this
mm,
exaggeration to me that's
mm,
holding me back from something more? What must be that something more here? What
yeah,
what must it be? And so, if it's an interpersonal fear, it might be like, maybe this is my new best friend. I need to like have this tough conversation. Maybe this is the conversation that will really like get this person going in their faith and produce a lot of fruit
hmm,
in them. So I try and have the positive what ifs tell a greater story than the fearful ones.
that's good.
So hopefully you see, you the listener, that like these Genesis 1 through 6 allusions help us create a narrative, create a story that relates back to us in all of these ways of like, I exaggerate my fears, right? I don't imagine the promised land on the other side of these fears, or oh, I never thought about like what is God offering to me? Right? Like
Hmm.
that's an interesting
Hmm.
twist too. What is God offering to me in this
Yeah,
moment of fear or faith that I have to choose between? these are all good questions that we could frankly spend another 20 minutes on.
Easily.
Um,
Yeah, and that's before even getting to the idea of not feeling worthy for wonderful gifts and
Gosh, yeah.
all of the issues there that we can certainly use to take us down a road we shouldn't be on.
Yes, and then our desires start to mimic those beliefs about ourselves. And I don't know if you tried that, but that is an excellent segue to the second half of our episode here and the second Bible selection that we're going to read. So, the spies give this report, and Caleb gives one side of it, and the other spies give another side, and we're about to witness the effect that this has on the Israel's community here. So, Kyle, if you can read Numbers 14 verses 1 through 9 for us, please.
Absolutely. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness! Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, I'm going to go with Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes, and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid." There it is again. "Do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." There it is
You want to
again.
preach it there? What do you got?
Man, this is just this is like powerful stuff. Just different leaders rising up, and I think the biggest thing that comes up for me is like oftentimes it takes one person to go against the crowd and stand up. And it's amazing how you start to see the dominoes fall when someone is courageous enough to say, "No,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to allow fear to dictate the decision that gets made."
Yeah. Yeah. It, and it that's the outnumbering here, right? Let's like so I believe we said this on one of the episodes, but this is like 1 million people, if historians are correct about this, up to 1 million people that are in the wilderness, and there's four. There's Moses and Aaron, Joshua and Caleb, and they are bowing and they're tearing their clothes. These are signs of great humility, which I think is also interesting here too. So, it wasn't necessarily by persuasion or power, right? Like they didn't brandish swords and torches, and they didn't get on their bullhorns. They tore the robes and they bowed and pleaded humbly
Mm.
to try and go about that persuasion as well. Which that too is something that's like I think maybe I'm projecting, but I think we're so easily prone to the loudness, whether that's the loudness of an actual voice or the viral tweet, the article that goes viral or something. We're so prone to being swayed by power that we
Mhm.
forget God's way of persuasion through humility and through truth, right? Like I think which one of it was it? Was it Joshua? It sounds like both Joshua and Caleb said to the entire assembly, right? They kind of preach it. This land
Mm.
is exceedingly good, which I wanted to look up the Hebrew of it. I imagine this is probably the same phrase in Genesis 1 at the end of creation. very good, right? This
Mm,
is very good. And so again, there's this admission back to the garden. Like,
how about
guys,
it?
here it is. We've been trying to get back to the garden. This land is very good. It's exceedingly good. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us. And I
Mhm.
think the plea there is not this like doubt. It's not this doubt that the Lord isn't pleased with them. It's look, like you're making him displeased with your lack of faith. And so don't walk away from his pleasure in you. Like don't do that. He's pleased with us and he wants to lead us, but you are the ones that are walking away from it. So do not
Mm,
rebel, right? So like anyway, all of that to say is that they're basing it in the truth, not the fears. And they're not trying to create a fear dynamic on the other end either of you better do this or right. It's no, God wants to show his pleasure and lead you to this. It's not a power play. It's not God's going to destroy you if the Canaanites and the Amalekites and aren't going to destroy you, God will. Like that could have been their message, and it
well,
was
and I think it's
totally
also, illustrative of your classic, hero's journey. It's
yeah.
gonna get harder near the top of the mountain.
Mhm.
And here you see, the majority of folks dropping like flies in terms of having their doubts and looking to pick other leaders. And it's like, just takes a couple folks that are courageous enough to tell the truth and be like, hang on, we just saw this. This is good. This lines up. Now's not the time for fear. Now's not the time for a pivot, as they
Mhm.
say in corporate culture. It's time to double down on the strategy and get moving.
Yeah, I was on Twitter and saw this one thread that was like, "Life is hard, so choose your hard." Right,
Yes.
right? Like, so there's the difficulty of leadership, or there's the difficulty of Egypt. You've got all these people that are saying, "I'd rather go back to Egypt," and I wish they would have finished the sentence. The sentence is, "I wish we could go back to Egypt and be enslaved again." That also is hard, right?
Hmm.
But their fears have somehow made that difficulty, that choice better, a better
Yeah,
offering than the difficulty of faithfulness, the difficulty of leading, the difficulty of joining the four instead of the 999,996 people that are all going the other direction, right? And
for sure.
so making that choice of which difficulty you're going to choose is something that often evades us as modern day Christians. We've got it so plush in so many ways that we forget that these difficult choices are often the right ones. But were numb, they were anesthetized to the difficulty of not making the good difficult choice. I hope that wasn't too meta, but hopefully you see what's going on here with the four, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb, making the difficult choice of humble leadership and pleading the truth over the people versus what when you take a step back, why? Why would they choose Egypt and slavery? One of the other incongruencies that I wanted to make sure to point out, Kyle, is in verse 4, and they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Remember how they got out of Egypt and escaped? Do you remember the means by which they escaped Egypt?
Yeah, this miraculous parting of the Red Sea, which is wild.
And can't be done through anyone human. The only human that it seemed to work through, Moses, was who God chose, not the people. And so
Yeah, how
this
quickly we forget. Like who do you think's gonna step up that like hadn't stepped up before?
right.
That's not
What a vacuum to fill. Like not 999,996 people. You know there's going to be an all-out war for who that chosen leader is going to be.
sure.
And you can see like the how quick this situation is going to devolve if they were even to try and go that direction because there's divinity that is trying to be attained and like I can part the Red Sea. I bet I can do what Moses did. And they're just blind to God being the rescuer, God being the savior, which we will come back to at the very end of this episode. So, they're trying to play the role of God by choosing a leader. They're trying to play the role of God by splitting a Red Sea and going back to Egypt when it's not at all what God is like or his will for them. And so I'm going to cover a couple verses that we're not going to read, but there's this interesting back and forth between the Lord and Moses, and the Lord being upset by the people's actions and the rebellion, and Moses making this plea of, please don't be upset. Please don't pour your wrath on us, because the Egyptians will find out. He says that the Egyptians will find out, and we'll be a mockery, and you'll be a mockery, God, to the Egyptians if you let us out here just to destroy us. And calls upon the Lord to be slow in anger and abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion, but not leaving the guilty unpunished. And so I'm going to read verse 20 now, 20 through 25. So after Moses makes this plea, the Lord replied, verse 20, I have forgiven them as you asked. Isn't that amazing? Wow. I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times. You got these 10 spies, right? And this disobedience 10 times. Not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. And so a couple observations here is God forgives, right? So he forgives them. Like Moses makes the plea for forgiveness. He says, you got it. I forgive them as you asked, which, oh my gosh, there's so much there. And there's this amazing pointing towards Jesus, and even Jesus on the cross, like asking, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing. And I feel like this story is supposed to be in our heart for so much of the Gospels. But when do we reference this, this back and forth, this repartee between Moses and the Lord in those Gospels storytellings? But the consequences are still very real, right? They wanted to go back to Egypt, and the Lord's like, they saw the signs. They saw the signs in Egypt. They saw the signs through the Red Sea. They saw the signs in the desert, and they still disobeyed me. What he could have said, Kyle, and what I don't know, what I might have said is, go ahead. You deserve Egypt then. And instead, he says they will be punished. They won't be allowed in the promised land. But the reason why I left this verse 25 in there about right, it seems kind of random, right? Hey, the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys. Turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. What he's saying is, I'm not going to lead them back to Egypt. Sure, the consequences, okay, they want Egypt. Well, then they don't get the promised land. But I'm going to protect them. I'm going to forgive them. I'm going to protect them. Yes, it'll be 40 years in the desert, and their generations won't see the promised land. But we find out later, like, their shirts never wear out, their shoes never wear out, they're fed every day, like, they're protected. Now, that's a journey itself, and it has all sorts of ups and downs through the rest of the book of Numbers. But I wanted to point out this nature of God in the Old Testament that isn't the one that we often think of in the Old Testament, and yet it's here, right? There's forgiveness. There's consequences that line up with the people's own choices and their own desires. We talked a little bit about that in Genesis 3 episodes. And then there's protection, right? Which also in Genesis 3, there's the skin, the garment of skin that covers them now that they're in the wilderness. And here's them being protected once again. Any thoughts on any of that? The forgiveness part, the consequences part, the protection part, anything rolling in your brain there, Kyle?
A lot. I'll try to hold back because I think it could take us on a whole other path. But what a just God. And I think this is a really good example when it's so easy to say, well, if God existed, then insert these bad things, wouldn't happen,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, right.
There
Yeah.
wouldn't be sickness, there wouldn't be death, there wouldn't be, why'd so and so in my family died, and those that have been believers for a while, understand the nature of the fallen world. And yet, I still believe there are some larger examples like this one that show a very just God that delivered a very fitting punishment while, like a loving parent, also still took care of them in their sin and disobedience. I think it also shows, and this is probably a topic for another day, but it also shows that the Lord does give consequences, which I think
Mhm.
in many ways, a lot of folks look and like, oh no, God loves us, holy, and he would never do anything to hurt us. And okay, true. And he also gives consequences.
Yes. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that he loves us any less. In fact, quite the opposite, much like a caring parent wants to raise their little ones to be productive and loving members of society, they are also disciplined to uh, ensure that they grow up to be incredible human beings. And it's just a pretty cool example here in the little book of Numbers.
That's right. Hidden in the story that we talk about certain aspects of it, right? The fruit and
Yeah.
the spies and all that, but in this dialogue, this repartee back and
Yeah.
forth between Moses and the Lord,
So I
this
guess
is
I
pretty
did
cool.
dive
Yeah.
in, but
I wanted you to. That was great. Well, let's yeah, it's so good, and the parenting example is so true, and we all do this as parents, and I know not all of our listeners are parents, but my 5-year-old darted out on the road the other day when a car was pretty close by, and so the consequences, like she has to walk with me now down from the bus
mm-hmm.
stop. Why? Like, not because I'm a harsh parent, but I don't want her to hurt herself further. And I
Yep.
see that in God's actions here. There are consequences, and yeah, it stinks for sure. And yes, on a more cosmic scale than, my kiddo, but I can't have my kiddo running out on the road either. I want to nerd out on 2 of the names in this passage just to kind of like wrap us into, fold us into the invitations, because I think the names do a good job of this. So we've got
Yep. I
Joshua
feel
and
like we need
Caleb.
another section, right? It's now time for Bible names with Phil.
It's like an official segment of the
Yeah.
episode. Yeah, nerding out on names or something. Like Phil's nerding out on names. So here we are, nerding out on names. Joshua means the Lord saves, or Jehovah is salvation. Okay, I'll do both names. Joshua is the Lord saves, or Jehovah is salvation. And Caleb means dog. But there's this connotation of faithful to the end, or
Hmm.
loyal to the end. And so Joshua, one of the interesting notes about this is Jesus's name. And there's all sorts of details as to why we say Jesus instead of Joshua, but for what you need to understand is Jesus' name in Hebrew is Yeshua, right? It's Joshua,
Hmm.
and this is where he gets his name. And it's whenever we get to the Gospels and whenever we get to Jesus, that's when we will dig in on like why. Why was Jesus named after Joshua of all people? I cannot wait for that episode. And
Hmm.
yet we're gonna wait probably a year or two, I'm guessing, at least till we get to that episode. And yet here, for our understanding and for this episode, we want to focus in on, okay, it's Yahweh that saves. It's Jehovah that is salvation. And then we have Caleb, who's faithful to the end, and not just the end chronologically, but faithful to the fulfillment of the promises, loyal through it all and to the end. I like that it's in this order when they get to chapter 14 here, Joshua and Caleb, because I think that's the order we need to understand them in. When we truly understand that it's the Lord that is our salvation, right? Not our choices, not the choices that we make in fear, not our desires to go back to the sins that have enslaved us, right? When it really gets in our heart that it's the Lord that will always be our rescuer, well, then the proper response is to be loyal to the end. Joshua and Caleb, right? And even where did we read that? Where it was like, because Caleb, well, what verse was that? Do you remember that one? The Lord said, because Caleb has this spirit on him. Now I can't find it. Oh, yeah, there it is. Verse 24. Sorry. Chapter 14, verse 24. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. And so, when we fully recognize the Lord can rescue us from anything. Yeah, okay. Let's say the Nephilim are back. Fine, he's rescued us once from the Nephilim. He'll do it again. Like, it's that wholehearted, dogged loyalty to what God is like that is the true response to God, whether or not the fruitfulness happens, whether or not the faithfulness happens.
Yeah.
But Caleb got a taste for the fruit, and the rest of the Israelites chose the boot, right? They chose the boot out of the promised land. And that's why we came to the fruit or the boot. Will we recognize God as our Savior and choose the fruit? Or if we don't, we get the boot.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that before we get to our invitations for today, Kyle?
I love getting nerdy with the names here because I think that in many ways, I always come back to that identity piece, and there's there's a lot of good work around individuals that are looking for their identity, and when many of them find it, the enemy is going to do everything he can to dissuade you from believing it and or reframing it so that it takes away the power of that identity. And I think in many ways it can simply be who's defining, right? Who's defining these things? And if you defined Caleb as dog and left it sit there, okay, not very inspiring. But when you dig deeper and understand just, how do we define dog often? Man's best friend, always there, loyal to the end. It doesn't matter what kind of day you're having. They're there, happy to see you. It doesn't matter what's outside the door. They're coming with you. Someone's trying to take you down, they're going to run out and sacrifice themselves to protect you. Shoot, okay, that name's got some juice behind it. So, yeah, I think that's just another tie-in of don't let anyone else other than the Lord define the meaning of a name or an identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amen. Amen. And how easy is it to identify ourselves as Christians and just think of he died on the cross for me and I'm going to heaven someday, right? It's almost like he got me out of Egypt and he's going to take me to the promised land. But there's none of the difficulty that we talked about earlier, right? And there's none of the identity formation
Yeah.
in that sort of thinking.
In
And
fact, when
God
we see the identity, when we experience the challenges, we're surprised.
oh,
Why
yep.
are we surprised?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
This is part of the deal.
Yeah.
Right? The whole
And then
narrow path, the whole,
why did God bring us out here to be murdered by the Canaanites and the
Yeah.
Amalekites, right? And so yeah, oftentimes when we think of fruitfulness, we think of maturity. And there is a process as Christians to grow in fruitfulness, to grow in our maturity in Christ. And we should forever be praising what he did on the cross and, if you will, what he did to part the Red Sea for us. And we should be ever hopeful of what the promised land will be like. But the journey to get there is through difficulty, through the wilderness, and through experiencing God's blessings, and through faithfulness and choosing the fruit rather than the boot, and not going back to our sinful ways as a proper response to knowing God's faithfulness. So I didn't plan on resting so much on there, but I'm glad we did, because that identity stuff really does matter to both of us, to each of us, and hopefully to you, the listener, as well. Well, Kyle, do you have any specific invitations to add before I roll through the ones I have?
Not that I can think of. Let's invite away.
So I'll give 3 invitations here and then the benediction. And so we are invited in Numbers 13 and 14, right? Through the story that we just looked into, we're invited to see the fruit for what it is and as a promise for even more. And if we don't, we choose the boot, right? And so what's the boot? The boot is that we are invited. I know this invited is often a positive connotation, but we are invited to suffer the consequences of our own waywardness while still experiencing God's mercy and protection. And I think that's okay, right? We talked about it is okay to recognize this combination of both justice and mercy being enacted at the same time. And so, if there's something where you're starting to recognize the consequences of your sin, good. That is a good thing. And yet, if you can also recognize the mercy and protection he's had on you as well from it getting worse or, affecting others worse, that's also good. There's an invitation there. And then finally, the invitation to respond to God's rescue with a dogged-like loyalty, a loyalty through to the end. And so with all that, may your salvation fuel your to see God's love through the wilderness of your life and into the fruitfulness of his promises.
Thanks for listening to the Invitation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, kindly invite others, see what I did there, Kyle, to listen in by sharing it with a friend, posting about it on social media, or even leaving a rating and a review.
To catch all the latest and greatest, give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X at The Invitation Pod, and help us share the invitation with others. Thanks again. We hope you'll tune in to future episodes.